Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the History Changes podcast, Breaking the Social Contract. We're really honored with our guest on this episode, who is Robert Chenoweth, who is an activist. He's a Vietnam veteran. He was also a prisoner of war. And today we're going to hear some of his perspectives on life and that experience and beyond. So without further ado, Bob, if I may.
Sure. Yeah, my mom was the only one that called me Robert when she got mad at me. She'd say everything, Robert Preston Chenoweth. What do you do? So, I was born in 1947 on December 31st in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Eugene up until about halfway through sixth grade, and then our family moved back to Portland. And I finished elementary school in Portland and went to high school in Portland. I went to a polytechnic high school where we did academic work half of the day, and the other half of the day we did what people sometimes refer to now as trades. Uh, we got involved in things like automotive, pattern and foundry, electrical shop, welding and plumbing and all that kind of stuff. The idea of the Polytechnic School was to train high school kids to have a career in the trades. And I majored in aviation maintenance. We had an aviation program in our high school. And my last 2 years, I was an aviation major. So I learned how to work on aircraft and I learned how aircraft were put together and that sort of thing. And in 1966, a friend of mine and I joined the Army together. And the reason we picked the Army was because when we looked into the other services, they trained you to work on a particular system of an aircraft. So you might be trained to work on avionics or fuel systems or engines or weapons or whatever. But in the Army, they trained you to be what they call a crew chief.
Mm.
So you'd be assigned a light aircraft or a helicopter, and you're responsible for all the maintenance on that aircraft. And in most of the aircraft at that time, the crew chief flew as a crewman. So
So were you trained to work on helicopters initially?
Well, initially I was trained to work on pretty much anything in the Army inventory. It was a basic maintenance course, and you had familiarization with fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft. But when I finished that course, I went to the UH-1
Okay.
helicopter course. That was the Huey,
Yeah.
the ubiquitous helicopter of Vietnam. So. When I finished my training, my basic training was at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and that was from June of 1966 through September. And then I went to Fort Rucker and I finished my helicopter training at Fort Rucker in December of 66. I went home on leave, and in January of 1967, I went to Vietnam. And I was assigned to a logistics command flight section. The logistics command that I was part of was responsible for the movement of ammunition in the southern part of Vietnam in what they called three corps and four corps. So primarily we flew in the Mekong Delta area.
Okay.
And I also got involved with the unit that was adjacent to us that had gunship helicopters, and I flew with them on occasion as a gunship crewman because they were always short of crew. Their unit had was a larger company, aviation company than most, and they were always short of personnel. So uh, I flew for 11 months. Uh, was shot up a few times and shot down once. And I think the thing that I remember most about that time period was that even though my political consciousness was not very high, I had actually read a book about Vietnam. I'd read a book called Jump into Hell. It was about Dien Bien Phu, and I read part of a book called Street Without Joy, which
Mm.
is about the French colonial period, where the French were trying to reestablish their colonial rule in Vietnam in the war against the Viet Minh. So I wasn't totally ignorant of Vietnam, but my reading and my interest area was primarily in military aviation. I was a model builder. I built model planes of all the famous aces and stuff of World War II and World War One. And like I say, I really didn't have a political context to put my experience into, but I paid very close attention to what I saw and what I participated in, and so that came into play later on after I was captured because I was told a lot of things about what was going on in South Vietnam after I was in captivity, and my own experience supported what I was being told. So
So when you were, in training and you were originally deployed, would it be fair to say that you kind of took what was going on in Vietnam at sort of face value of what like the United States government was saying was its policy and approach?
yeah,
Would it
I
be
mean,
fair to?
I wasn't overly concerned with the politics. I was mostly concerned with I was excited to fly. I wanted to fly. And I was primarily, like most guys that went to Vietnam, at least initially, what you're concerned about was doing a good job, doing your job that you were trained to do and not screw it up,
Yeah.
But in December of 1967, as my tour was coming to an end, the Army had a program where if you extended your tour for 6 months, you'd be able to go on a free 30-day leave. Normally in the Army, you got 30 days leave a year. So for me, I was on a 3-year enlistment, and that meant I had 90 days of leave in the Army. But this program allowed you to have a free 30-day leave that didn't count against your regular leave time. And as it turned out, they would send you anywhere you wanted to go.
Mm.
So on this first leave, I went home. And I stayed home until early January of 68, and I returned to Vietnam on the about the 11th or 12th of January of 1968. The unit I was in during the time I was absent, that unit was disbanded and the assets were moved from Saigon. I was stationed at Ton Son Army Heliport, adjacent to Ton Son Air Base. And so the unit was moved about 300 miles north to a place called Quy Nhon. And so I reported to my old unit and found out that there was nobody there, and they said that they'd been deactivated and sent up north. So I hopped a C-130 up to Quy Nhon, and I'd been up there a couple of times on TDY, so I knew where the unit was because part of our unit had been stationed up there. So I got up there, I think it was about the 22nd of January. And our unit there had six Hueys and about half a dozen fixed wing aircraft, various types, U-1s and U-21s. So since I had a year experience already in Vietnam, I was immediately assigned an aircraft and uh, started flying. I think I flew my first mission the day after I got there. And we flew every day, just routine missions, and we did our maintenance work. And near the end of the month, my my helicopter was due for inspection, and when we opened it up, we found corrosion in the tail boom. So we turned the aircraft in and to maintenance company and got another aircraft in exchange for that. So we pulled maintenance on that aircraft and uh, began flying that. So a couple of days after that, our unit, well, at least my aircraft was assigned to go up to Da Nang for 3 days. It was a temporary duty. And at the end of that 3 day period, we were on our way back to Quy Nhon from Da Nang. And we were listening on the radios, and we were going to go into a base called Phuket to refuel on the way back. And the radio chatter was talking about don't don't come in here, don't land here, aircraft are being shot down, the base is under attack. Within a few minutes, we discovered that there was a big offensive going on all over South Vietnam, and all the major bases were under attack. And that turned out to be the Tet Offensive. That was the night of January 31st.
Wow.
So we finally made it into Quy Nhon and landed, and the airfield was under attack. We were told when I got back over to our main office to load our aircraft with personal gear and get ready to evacuate to Cam Ranh Bay. They were going to abandon the Quy Nhon airfield. But the South Koreans moved in a couple of companies of troops right around the perimeter, and they were able to hold off the attack. Quy Nhon was completely overrun, and so we ended up in firefights that night.
Wow.
We took our personal weapons and our machine guns from the aircraft and went back to our barracks. And we had bunkers in between the barracks, and we set up defensive positions. And when we got fired on, we fired back. So that went on all night. One of our aircraft had to fly a mission that night because there was a little hilltop base overlooking Quy Nhon that was being overrun, and so they got hit on the way up, and so it was a crazy few days, and things settled down after about the 6th of February, and then we got assigned again to go up to Da Nang for another 3 day period up there. And so we took off the afternoon of the 7th of February and flew up there, got ourselves situated, went to sleep, got up the next morning, and we had two passengers we were going to take to Dong Ha, which was a big Marine fire base up near the demilitarized zone.
Okay.
And the Army had a big supply base up there that had been attacked, and they'd lost communications with them.
Was
So we
that Quezon? Was this
No, it was Dong Ha
okay.
base.
Okay.
Quezon was about 20, 25 or so miles west of there where
Okay.
we were, but it was in that same area along Highway 9.
Okay.
So we had with us an Army lieutenant colonel who was part of that command structure, and we had a bunch of radio equipment, and he was going to go up there to see what was what and give them the radio equipment to help reestablish communications with their headquarters. So, and we also had a refrigerator mechanic with us because the morgue refrigeration units at Dong Ha had broken down, and they were being maintained by the Marines, but it was Army equipment. So the Marines had ordered parts to fix the refrigerators, and they were the wrong parts. So the Marines had asked for an Army refrigerator mechanic to come up and make sure the right parts got ordered and they got put in. So he was our other passenger. So we took off that morning. We flew up to Dong Ha, and we did our mission. We dropped off the radio equipment and just were ready to come back at the end of the day. It was about 4:30, and we were getting ready to leave, and it was very difficult to get fuel at Dong Ha at that particular time. So the colonel that was with us told us, "Don't worry," he says, "just down the road is a 1st Cavalry base, and we can get fuel down there." And we all looked at each other and thought, "There's no 1st Cavalry up here? They're in the Central Highlands. Well, he
Mhm.
knew that the 1st Cavalry had deployed a brigade up there along with their aviation. And what they were going to do, they were going to relieve Quezon, the attack that was going on at Quezon. So we landed there and we gassed up and we took off and we crossed Highway 1 and we were probably 4 or 5 miles from the coast. And the helicopter, we got hit by small arms fire. Uh, there was multiple people shooting at us and multiple streams of tracers coming up at the aircraft. The
Mhm.
pilot was hit, his windshield was hit. I saw him get hit. I saw the co-pilot get hit. I saw bullets hitting in the floor by my feet and exiting through the cabin roof. And all of a sudden there was a bang and the aircraft was on fire. And the whole inside of the cabin was on fire. Flames were coming up from the floor and from the transmission well, which was right behind me.
So were you sitting? So I think about a Huey, and you have the pilots up here, and then you have the space where were you sitting with your back, like looking forward?
Well, we were in a D model Huey, so that had an extended cabin and it had little areas on the side that they call the pocket, and the crew chief and gunner sat in those. So we were actually facing
I
out
see.
rather than forward.
I see.
Our two passengers were in those forward seats, and they were looking directly at the pilots.
I see.
So the pilot of the aircraft, Joe Rose, said, "I'm going to put her down." He was afraid. They'd learned in flight school that the tail boom on a Huey was held on with 4 bolts, and those bolts were made out of magnesium.
Mhm.
And if they caught fire, uh, they could burn through in less than 30 seconds, and you'd lose your tail boom. So the pilots were nervous. They wanted to get the aircraft on the ground. Unfortunately, when we landed in a cemetery and we hit a grave marker, a stone obelisk, which was very common in graves in Vietnam, and it destroyed our rotor blades. So I was thrown out of the aircraft, and when I kind of came to and was facing the aircraft on my knees, the first thing I noticed is that we had no rotor blades. So my heart kind of sank because I knew we weren't getting out of there. So I heard the pilot. He was calling out, "Get me out of the aircraft, get me out of here." And so I ran back to the aircraft. I pulled his door open. I couldn't get it open all the way. And I said, kick your windshield out. Go out through your front windshield." So that's what he did. He reared back in the seat, and the Huey front windshield was designed to be kicked out from the inside in an
Mhm.
emergency.
Mhm.
So he did that. Out he came. Uh, the refrigerator mechanic that had been sitting next to me, I saw him. He was burned from the waist up. He was literally smoking. He had smoke coming off him. And right about the same time, my gunner, Mike, came around the other side of the aircraft and he was also burned. And I saw him and he was smoking too. And I just thought, holy shit, what's going
Wow.
to happen next? And I grabbed my M14. I had an M14 rifle on the floor of the helicopter. I grabbed that and I grabbed a couple of magazines, and the pilot came around and he said, "Let me have your M14 and take your M60 off the mount." Well, I didn't want to do that because the gun, when I fired the gun before, I was unable to stop it from firing when I let up on the trigger. So it's what they call a runaway gun. And so I had to open the feed tray cover up and get the ammunition out of it to stop it from firing. And I didn't want to take it with me. I wanted my M14, but the pilot took my M14, so I grabbed the M60 and what was left on the belt of ammunition.
Which is a much larger gun than an
Yeah, and
M14. It's a
this M60 machine gun was the D model. It was designed to sit on a mount and be on the helicopter, be
yeah,
attached to the
yeah.
helicopter. It wasn't a
Hmm.
free gun.
Yeah.
So anyway, the 6 of us finally got ourselves sorted out, and I suggested that we get away from the aircraft because it was burning. And interestingly enough, the co-pilot said, "Well, let's stay near the aircraft." And I said to these guys, I said, "Haven't you ever seen any World War II movies where these guys land in their plane and then the plane blows up?" And so they all looked at me, and so we started moving. We went towards the tail of the aircraft and started moving towards the coast. We were heading east, and so at that point, really, we had two wounded guys. The co-pilot had been shot in the leg. The bullet came up through the floor and hit the inside of his thigh. So pilot used his belt to make a tourniquet for him. So we were not in good shape at that point, and we tried for about 45 minutes to head to the coast. You know, we had the idea maybe we could try to get a boat and get out in the water, get away from the beach. But it wasn't going to happen. And we were eventually just kind of funneled and surrounded by literally by the people that shot us down. And it was a group of guerrillas, NLF fighters from the local area, from right from the village where we ended up in. Uh, and they surrounded us and they made it real clear to us that we had a chance to surrender. So we talked amongst ourselves for a few minutes and we assessed what we had. And my opinion was that we really didn't have the means to resist. We could have fought, but we'd have been killed. There's no doubt in my mind that that would have happened. So we made the decision as a group to give up, even though we'd all heard stories, what the Viet Cong would do to you if they captured you, but we really had no idea.
Yeah.
So we threw our weapons out, we stood up, they came out. It was clear that these guys were not soldiers in the sense that they had the kind of military training we had, about how do you deal with prisoners. They kind of didn't know what to do with us.
Hmm.
But they picked up all of our equipment. They took us into the village that we had just walked through the village a few minutes before, and it was empty.
Wow. Hmm.
When we came back into the village, it was full of people.
Huh.
They were uh, they were delighted that we had been captured and that nobody had been killed in the process. The wounded guy, our co-pilot, he did not get captured with us initially. He crawled off into the bushes behind us and didn't surrender immediately. It was the next day before they captured him. But the rest of us were taken into the village. The guy that was burned, they gave him tea. They sat us down. They took our boots. They took our personal belongings. And we waited for a couple of hours until it got completely dark. And then they moved us. Uh, we moved along Rice Paddy Dyke until we got to a canal. Then we got in boats and we rode in boats for probably 45 minutes or an hour. And when we got out of the boats, we came up onto what was Highway 1, the main highway that ran north-south in Vietnam, which we had crossed over,
Hmm.
several miles previously. By the next morning, we were up into the forest, triple canopy forest, and we began a journey that lasted 7 days to get to the first camp where we stayed. And we stayed in that camp for a month. The co-pilot was captured the day after us. And after about a month of recuperating and the guys that were wounded getting healed up as best they could, we moved again. We stayed at another camp for a few days, and then in the evening we were marched again up into higher ground, and we came out onto a road. And the guards told us to sit along the side of the road. And next thing we knew, here comes a truck. It was a Russian army truck. And we all looked at this truck and we said, holy shit, we're on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Wow.
That's when we knew we were on the
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we rode trucks during the night and slept during the day. There were rest camps all along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There were thousands of people moving up and down the trail. And there were work crews because when the Americans would bomb a section of the trail, these youth groups would come out in the evening and they would repair, fill in the bomb craters and get the road serviceable again, and then go back to their rest camps and sleep. So whatever damage was done one night, it would be repaired by the next night. So we rode the trucks for about 3 weeks. And finally, we began riding in the day, and we knew at that time that there was a bombing halt north of the 20th parallel. So we knew that we were north of the 20th parallel, which also meant that we were in North Vietnam. So we eventually came to a village, and we were in the province of Nghệ An, which is, if you look at a map of the northern part of Vietnam, there's a skinny part, and then as you get farther north, it starts to fan out. It gets wider, and right at that area where the skinny goes to the fat part, that's Nghệ An province. So we stayed in a village there. There was three hamlets in the village, and we settled into a camp there, and it was our first experience with English language interpreters that had a good enough grasp of English that they could talk to us about Vietnam's history and the history of the war and who they were, why they were fighting. So we began to learn a little bit about Vietnamese history, but at the
Mhm.
same time, during the day we went out and worked. Uh, we went through the harvesting and planting of rice. We grew melons and pineapples and peanuts and all different kinds of stuff. We had animals to take care of, and we repaired bomb shelters in the village, both for the villagers and for ourselves, because there were slip trenches and bomb shelters all over the place. And when it rained, the logs would fall in and the mud would fall into the slip trench and you'd have to dig it all out and rebuild it. So we did that and just we got very familiar with village life, and people were generally pretty nice to us. And if we were out working, they would bring us tea, they would bring us slices of pineapple and stuff to eat. And we began. For me, it was the beginning of a process of changing, not really changing, but beginning to understand my own personal experience and being able to put that into a broader context, the context of understanding the war from the Vietnamese perspective. And one of the things that I remember especially about the village community was just the level of unity, how people worked together, how they got along with each other. And of course, we saw that coming up the Ho Chi Minh Trail as well. And one of the things, because I talked about it with the other prisoners, one of the things that we came to realize, we'd always been told that the Viet Cong, they forced people they chained people to the machine gun and all this kind of stuff, and that people weren't fighting because they wanted to, they were fighting because they were forced into it by the communists. And what we saw was just the opposite. The kind of dedication that people had, that doesn't come from being forced. It comes from having a political consciousness, an understanding of your own history, and an obligation. And they would tell us that, we're defending our country. And they said, if you know our history, you'll understand what we're doing. And like people know nowadays, but nobody knew at the time, Vietnamese had a long history of trying to maintain their own identity. You
Mhm.
know, literally thousands of years of fighting against Chinese occupation. But in the modern era, French colonialism, the French came in the 1880s and occupied most of Vietnam. And, there were resistance movements and political struggles in Vietnam uh, so that, you know, people wanted to have their independence. They wanted to be an independent country. And it was a long struggle for them that in 1945, when Vietnam declared its independence, uh, they thought their job was done. They thought that the Allied powers would support them and allow them to have an independent country. But instead, the United States and the British and the French all worked together to recolonize Vietnam. And so the Vietnamese ended up having to fight a war that lasted 9 years to try to regain their independence. And of course, that they were partly successful, but it led to what became our war, what the Vietnamese called the American War in Vietnam. So
At this time, because of course, as you mentioned, 1945. Of course, there's lots of historical documentation, stories about Ho Chi Minh reaching out to Truman, and stories about the band playing the Star Spangled Banner when he declared independence. And of course, naturally, as was probably the case in the case of the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, I think there was a sense from nationalists in that part of the world that the United States, being this revolutionary state that had defeated its own colonial experience, that they would embrace their own independence. When you were in as a prisoner of war, did that sort of contradiction start to sink in
yeah,
terms of?
yeah. No, what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, there's a wonderful book called I think it's called America's Albatross, Vietnam Still America's Albatross. It was written by a guy named Archimedes Patty.
Oh yes.
And Archimedes Patty was a CIA operative
Mm-hmm.
that worked with the Viet Minh in 1944 and 45 in Vietnam. And he actually sat down with Ho Chi Minh when Ho was writing the Declaration of Independence, because Ho couldn't exactly remember the initial lines from the American Declaration of Independence, but he wanted to use that. So Patty reminded him of the language, which he included in his September 2nd, 1945 Declaration of Independence speech. And yeah, I mean, it was the Vietnamese always said, that if America was afraid of China, that they couldn't have picked a better ally in Southeast Asia as a bulwark against the Chinese expansion than Vietnam, because the Vietnamese had a long-standing animosity towards China. The Vietnamese didn't want to be Chinese. They wanted to be Vietnamese. They had their own language, their own history, and they wanted to maintain that. And I mean, for us, it was more than ironic to learn that history and to learn how, having had the chance to honor uh, the rights of the Vietnamese, that they chose not only not to do it, but to back the French in their effort to recolonize. And of course, at the same time, they were supporting the British to come back to Malaya. They were
Mm-hmm.
supporting the Dutch to come back into Indonesia. And, they didn't grant independence to the Philippines, like they talked about in the 1930s and 40s. And I think the leaders of these political movements in these countries felt betrayed. And, it ended up uh, really being the wrong choice. And then, of course, during what they call the First Indochina War with the French, the United States financed that war. Eisenhower said 80% of that war was funded by the United States. And if you look at photographs of that First Indochina War, those French and colonial soldiers. They're driving American equipment. They're wearing American helmets and clothes, carrying American rifles. And, we made that decision, or at least the United States made that decision from my perspective to to be on the wrong side of history. And so once we began to understand that level of, then I began to start to see my own experience in a different context. I began to rethink a lot of what I had seen. I had seen demonstrations in Saigon when I lived there, and I'd seen press ganging of South Vietnamese youth that were just literally taken out of their homes and thrown in the back of military trucks and taken off to be in the army. And, watching the families just being terrorized as their kids were taken away. And I had a few Vietnamese friends in Saigon, and they would talk to me about, they called them the generals, Nguyen Van Chieu and Ngo Dinh Diem and all these people that we had installed in power that had no popular support among their own population. And, the CIA even, bumped off a guy or two in order to try to reconsolidate our efforts. But we also, I also worked a lot with the South Vietnamese army. We hauled South Vietnamese soldiers, and we saw how they conducted themselves on the battlefield. And these were not people that were fighting to save their country. Most of them were not there because they wanted to be, and the ones that were, that they were as likely to take it out on their own people as they were to take it out on the Viet Cong if they ever found the Viet Cong. So I remember we would drive back and forth between where we lived in Saigon and the heliport, and we would drive past the presidential palace, and there were Buddhist monks that were conducting hunger strikes in the park adjacent to the presidential palace. And at first there was hardly anybody there, but day after day we would go by and there would be literally hundreds and hundreds of people that had gathered around those Buddhist monks, and they were protecting them from the police and from the soldiers. And it was an eye-opening experience. And like I said, for me at that time, I didn't have much of a political consciousness but all that kind of fell into place after I was captured and learned about the history, because the Vietnamese would talk about this and that was going on in South Vietnam. Some of the other prisoners would say, "Oh, I never saw anything like that." And I don't know, I don't know whether to believe them or not. But for me, it was a no-brainer because I had seen those things myself, and I knew the things they were talking about were true. So probably around the fall, late fall of '68, there were a group of us that pretty much shared the same perspective and approached the Vietnamese to be able to, we knew about the anti-war movement. We were beginning to understand a little bit more about what was going on at home. And, we asked, can we write letters? I wanted to write a letter to my senator, to Mark Hatfield. And because I knew he had spoken out against the war. Was opposed to the war. And the Vietnamese basically just said, no, 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 we're not going to allow you to do that. And we said, well, why not? And they said, well, when you go home, people will say that you were forced to do that. And it actually took a very
Hmm.
long time. It took until the spring of 1970 before a group of us were able to actually raise our voices against the war, to write letters to Congress or to write letters to the American people, open letters, that kind of thing. But we had the feelings, and the feelings were strong enough to where, at least with some of us, not all the prisoners felt the same way that we did, but not all the prisoners had the same experience. A lot of I was with people that were captured in South Vietnam for the most part. I didn't live with the pilots that were shot down in the north. They were in a separate camp from us, and I think the when we began to hear on the radio that some of those pilots were also making statements against the war and writing letters, then finally the Vietnamese allowed us to do it. And we also produced a handwritten magazine. We would do a magazine about every couple of months. It was called New Life. And unfortunately, I've made several trips to Vietnam, and other people know about this. We have looked and tried to find those
Mm.
magazines and have been unable to locate them.
Hmm.
Some of the stuff that I did while I was a prisoner there, uh, the Vietnamese have found, and they have it as part of their record. But unfortunately, that magazine was not part of it. So.
And I think, that's a really, and that's the first, and of course we've talked in the past, but that's the first time I've learned of that New Life magazine, which sounds just like an absolutely fascinating, like historical item, and one that, like,
Oh.
I mean, few Americans know about, say, for example, the alliance between the United States and the Vietnamese during World War II. And I have to say, how few Americans would know about that.
Yeah.
And it really, I think in you can maybe speak to this. It really contrasts with the sort of maybe stereotypical or cliche way that I think a lot of Americans after the war have viewed that experience.
Right.
Um, you were granted the ability to write. Um, and would you say it's pretty consistent that there's been a kind of distorted image of how at least in your case, how the prisoner of war experience was?
Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'll introduce you to this book. Uh, I don't know if you know who Jerry Lemke is.
I don't think
He
so.
wrote a book called Spitting Image, where he discredits the idea that peace activists spat on Vietnam veterans. And he teamed up with Tom Wilbur, who was the son of Walter Wilbur, who was also a POW and who protested the war as a prisoner and refused, when he came home, refused to say that he did it by force. He said he did what he did voluntarily, and he was on 60 Minutes, and they tried to discredit him on 60 Minutes, but he stuck to his guns about. He said it was his conscience that that made him do what he did after deliberating. So Tom and I have traveled to Vietnam together, and he got interested in trying to find out about his father's experience. And the two officers that were charged with collaboration after they returned, for us, having officers that were willing to do the same thing that we were willing to do. That was a morale booster for us. I mean, it gave us a lot more confidence because, enlisted guys always figure that officers know more than they do. They had more education and stuff like that. And if they thought the war was wrong, how could we possibly be wrong?
Yeah.
So that book, and this is another one I think worth knowing about. Uh, and they're both available, through Amazon or whatever. This is part of a traveling exhibit. This is the book that went along with the traveling exhibit that was done by uh, several people, including Ron Carver and Dave Courtwright. Dave Courtwright wrote a book in 1974 uh, called GIs in Revolt. And it's about the GI resistance movement and the publication of underground newspapers. the coffee houses and all these kinds of things that were set up around military bases, the FTA show that Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland and them did where they traveled around to military bases in the Philippines and Japan. And these programs that they put on were attended by thousands of GIs, active duty people that would go off base because they couldn't do any of this on base. And that's another part of our history. There was a huge resistance movement, especially by 1970, among active duty military and veterans. And of course, there was Vietnam Veterans Against the War was created, and then, you know, just a lot of opposition to the war that's not generally known or understood by the public. In 1969, when Nixon began the POW campaign, the bumper stickers and the bracelets and only Hanoi knows and all that, that was a campaign designed to make the POWs appear as victims of the war rather than perpetrators. And it also uh, became a pretext for continuing the war. The argument was, oh, our prisoners are being so badly treated, and we can't leave, we can't let them down, we've got to stay and make sure we have peace with honor and we return our POWs. So, I mean, it was a big public relations campaign that snowed a lot of people. They spent a lot of money and it snowed a lot of people. And when the prisoners were released after the Paris agreements were signed, uh, basically you were given a choice. We were all told when release time came, look, if you play ball, if you go along with the program, recant, say you were forced to make statements and stuff like that, no, nothing's going to happen to you. If you just play ball, go along with the program. If you want to, you can stay in the Army. They offered POWs that your time as a POW would count double towards retirement. So, I mean, if I had chosen to stay in the Army, I could have retired at the age of 37
Wow.
with a 20-year pension. And there were POWs that did that, that stayed in. My door gunner did that. He stayed in the Army.
What did you think about that? So in this podcast, the theme is kind of breaking the social contract. So we're looking
Right.
at some of some of the things that have occurred in the United States that have led to a decline in sort of trust in government. Not that everything has to be about that, but when you got that sort of offer, um, how did you think about that? Where did you feel like you were sort of being bought off? How did you?
Well, I knew what they were trying to do, and most of us the we became there were eight of us that became known as the Peace Committee, and we were all charged with collaborating with the enemy. One of our guys, Larry Kavanaugh, committed suicide in June of 73 after he came home, and we weren't buying it. I mean, I had no intention of staying in the military no matter what kind of offer they made. And I think the Army eventually ended up feeling the same way. The charges were dropped after Kavanaugh's funeral, and I was able to get out of the Army. But I had been home on leave after I came home in March, and I spent a couple of weeks at Letterman Army Hospital at the Presidio in San Francisco. Having dental work done and, just health checks and all that kind of stuff. And then I was able to go home on leave. During that time, I got a letter from Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda. And the letterhead was from an organization called the Indochina Peace Campaign. So I went down to Santa Monica, California, where they were and met with them. They invited me to do that. And I met the staff of this organization. I'd sought out a couple of different anti-war groups, but in the Portland area, but met a few people, but didn't really. What they wanted to talk about was what they had done. And in 1973, even though the peace agreements were signed, the war wasn't over. The United States was still funding the Saigon regime. And what the Indochina Peace Campaign, what their objective was, their analysis was that the war needed to be brought to a complete end. And the way to do that was to lobby Congress and cut the funding to the Thieu regime because they still maintained political prisoners and they were still carrying out fighting. And so the Indochina Peace Campaign had done a national tour in 1972, I think. And they had with them a POW, a guy named George Smith, he was a Green Beret and he was captured in 1963 in South Vietnam and released by the Viet Cong in 1965, along with a couple of other guys. So he talked about his experience, and Tom talked about, the politics of cutting aid to the Saigon regime. And when I traveled with them, uh, there was a French guy who had been released from Chihuahua prison in Saigon. He and a fellow teacher were arrested in Saigon in 1971 distributing anti-war leaflets. And they didn't have a trial or anything. They were put immediately into Saigon's most notorious political prison. And when those guys were released because of the peace agreements, they came out with the names of 10,000 political prisoners who were supposed to have been released according to the Paris Accords, but the Saigon regime did not release them.
Hmm.
So we contrasted our experiences, mine as a POW in the North, and him basically in the tiger cages in South Vietnam. And it was very informative. And for me, I got a chance to meet the anti-war movement. We traveled I think we traveled to about 35 cities in 13 states over about a 4-month period. And I met people from all walks of life, from all aspects of the anti-war movement, from, Socialist Workers' Party to Communist Party guys to New Mobe to hippies, you name it. And it was important for me because I really got a feel for, what the peace movement was, different kinds of people that had taken part in demonstrations and things like that. And I have to tell you honestly, when I came home, I didn't know if I would have any support. I didn't know how the anti-war movement would feel about what we had done.
Hmm.
And to my surprise and delight, people were very supportive. And I don't know if you remember the Gainesville Eight. There were five ex-servicemen or eight ex-servicemen that were, I think it was the Republican convention in Miami or something. They were charged with trying to disrupt and all this kind of stuff. The charges ended up being dropped against these guys, but when I met all these guys in Gainesville, Florida, and there were all kinds of fundraisers and dinners and everything, and it just it made me realize that to get some idea at least of the political movement and what people's level of consciousness was about the war and everything. And the Indochina Peace Campaign activity proved to be very successful because ultimately we were able to finally cut off funding to the Thieu regime and to help bring about the release of all those political prisoners. And that pretty much coincided with the end of the war in April
Yeah.
of 75. So uh, I felt pretty good about that. I was impressed with the people in the Indochina Peace Campaign for several reasons. One, particularly Tom had been to Vietnam on several occasions, and Tom and Jane had gone together. And just being able to sit down with them, at the dinner table or whatever, and talk about what they understood about Vietnam from their trips to Vietnam. They got it. They understood the history, and they knew based on their own analysis and uh, their understanding of how the Vietnamese looked at things, that this was the best thing they could do. As Americans, the Vietnamese couldn't lobby Congress. They couldn't write to their senators. So that Americans had to do that. This was our country, and we had to do that. And uh, you know, to me, it was the best possible use of my time and resources. So I was more than happy to do that. At the same time, I started college. I everybody said you ought to go to college, put your experience into some kind of context. And so I eventually became an anthropologist and did museum work. And my first full-time museum job was at the Air and Space Museum in
Hmm.
DC. They they wanted to hire me because they had nobody on staff that had ever worked with helicopters, knew anything about helicopters. So I worked there. I worked as a historian for almost a year for the Navy. Then I eventually moved to Hawaii. I was a museum technician at the U.S. Army Museum of Hawaii in Waikiki. Talked about Hawaii's military history and the Army history there. Our museum building was an old Coast Artillery battery that had been turned into a museum. So we interpreted the military history in Hawaii going back to the first contact with Europeans, and Kamehameha
Hmm.
unifying the Hawaiian Islands into a single kingdom and all that sort of stuff. So,
Wow.
and then I was the curator at the USS Arizona Memorial.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was there for 3 years. That was my first Park Service job.
Hmm.
And I was the curator there for the 50th anniversary,
Hmm.
and I came back for the 55th anniversary. I came back for the 60th, the 65th. I headed the oral history team at the 60th anniversary, interviewing both Pearl Harbor survivors, veterans of Pearl Harbor, and also the Japanese participants. I interviewed quite a few of the Japanese pilots. Uh, It was amazing. I had an amazing career. I had a wonderful career. And, uh, when my first son was born, it became clear to us that we did not have the financial resources to continue to live in Hawaii. So I had to look for a Park Service job on the mainland. I found it at Grant Coors Ranch in Montana. It was a historic site that interpreted and commemorated the open range cattle era in the West. And I was there for 3 years and learned about Nez Perce National Historical Park, did work with them, was invited by the superintendent to apply for the job there, and that was in 1995. And so we moved from Montana to Clarkson, Washington. And I stayed there until 2017 when I retired, working with the Nez Perce tribe and running the museum collection and working at the park. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And you have a little percussion hobby, if I remember correctly.
Well, my percussion hobby had deep roots. I started playing the drums in sixth grade.
Oh.
And we had an elementary school band in seventh and eighth grade, and I played in that. And when I was in high school, I played in our band and orchestra. And also, when I was in the sixth grade and my brother was in the seventh grade, our uncle introduced us to drum and bugle corps. And my brother and I both became active in one of the drum and bugle corps in Portland. And I did it until I joined the Army, and my brother did it until he, what they call aged out at age 21. And so I had a hiatus there during Vietnam and for a
Mm.
few years after that. And when I moved to Hawaii, I got back into doing percussion and playing in a band and everything. And I still play in a band today. We do traditional music,
Okay.
Irish music, and traditional what people call roots music, American
Yeah.
music. And yeah, it's a great hobby. I've made absolutely wonderful friends, and especially these days with the cancer and everything, to have friends like that is there's nothing that
Yeah.
comes close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So,
Bob,
yeah,
when we just as we finish up here, I wonder, um, I mean, this experience, and you think about, for example, I think in a lot of sectors in the United States, activists during this period of time and in general, they're oftentimes sort of looked down upon, even maligned by society. And so when you look back on your experience, you look back on this moment more broadly historically, are there any takeaways, any analysis of your own about what the United States was doing then and what's happened since? I know it's a big, big, big thing, but I'm just curious if you have any takeaways.
sure, sure. Uh, I mean, I have my perspective, uh, which is that we are an imperialist country. Uh, we demonstrate that on a daily basis. We have 900 military bases around the world. Uh, the amount of money that we spend on military activity and equipment. Uh, I mean, you talk about solving our social problems. The money that would take to solve our social problems, I think, is a drop in the bucket compared to what we're spending on trying to manipulate other countries around the world, we overthrow. It didn't stop when the war ended. We were in Latin America, in South America. We created the war on drugs. We supported one dictatorship after another in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, you name it, Colombia, Peru, Chile. We overthrew a legitimate government in Chile. Uh, it's endless, and we're at it today, manipulating governments around the world, financing war efforts. You know, the whole thing with the Shah. I lived in DC when that was going on. And then we wonder why the Middle East is in turmoil. Well, part of the reason why the Middle East is in turmoil is because we supported dictators in those countries that their population didn't like. And then all of a sudden we're surprised when these ultra conservative religious movements would take over in places like Iran. So uh, we have a lot to answer for, but I think we also need to understand the part that our government plays in these activities. When the Cold War ended, everybody thought that NATO would be dissolved. What would be the reason to have NATO? Because the Warsaw Pact collapsed. We started, West Germany and East Germany reunited, but what happened instead? Where we reinforce NATO, get countries like Sweden and Finland to join NATO, and then we wonder why the Russians feel like they're surrounded. Uh, it's it's a shame because I don't think the average American understands their own history. They certainly don't understand their early history, westward expansion and all that sort of thing. And all of that is mixed up. It's mixed up with racism. It's mixed up with neocolonialism and imperialist aspirations. And, you know, and we end up with the kind of leadership we have today because basically people don't know any better. And it's not an indictment in a sense, but to get back to the basic point of this, my feeling, at least from the time of Vietnam, was the government did all sorts of things to discredit itself during the Vietnam War. They essentially lied to the American people. Allie. So it's you know, I lost my train of thought.
Sorry, this is Danny's. I'm just, or Liam's. I'm just giving it back to him. Danny took
My son and his buddy just
Tell him I said hi.
hi. Doing a Zoom. I'm doing an interview.
We're just finishing up. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, it's not you know, it's not a mystery to me that we're in the situation we're in
Yeah.
because on the left, I mean, the progressive movement on the left began to understand the things that the government was doing and why how they were lying to us and what they were doing in the process. And the right obviously has its own version of that for different reasons, different motivations, but uh, it's not surprising to me in a sense that people have ended up making the choices they've made based on, you know, whatever you want to call it, fake news, false information. But in a sense, it's also pretty unprecedented. I mean, this president that we have, the things he does and says are very uncharacteristic of the way politicians normally operate. And for some people, that's very exciting because they think that, oh, this is our guy. You know, he calls a spade a spade. He points out the bullshit, all the rest of it. But, you know, at the same time, there's there's that lack of education that allows people to make informed judgments based on the knowledge they have. I don't think the media helps because the you know, I refer to the media, lots of people do, as the corporate media. It's not an institution that has free will. They're not out there digging up all the facts. You know, they're part of a program and they have to toe the line, otherwise they don't have jobs and they don't have money. And you know, it's tough to it's tough to get by in that world if you're not willing to go along. If you start criticizing or speaking out against the things that are happening and the decisions that are being made, uh, you're not working. And these days, if you're a government employee, you don't even have to have a strong political view. All you have to do is have made some decision in the past that the current administration doesn't like, and you lose your job. And that's crazy. I mean, that's having worked in the government. I mean, I know the government's not perfect, but I know the people that work in government, for the most part, are honest people and trying to do a good job and be good public servants. And those are the people that are paying the price.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we have some work to do. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, Bob, thank you so much for doing this. Your story is a really great historical resource, and it's really exciting to be able to preserve it and send it out there so people can learn from this. And I'm really grateful for you agreeing to do this.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, and so
let's stay in touch.
Yes, I agree. This will not be the last time we chat.
Okay. All right.
Take care, Bob.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.